Security, get him out. This meeting's for decision makers, not maintenance staff. That's what the manager said. Loud, cold, in front of everyone. All because the man standing at the table, black, quiet, sharply dressed, didn't look like the CEO, investor, or architect he actually was. No one stopped it. No one spoke up. Because to them, he couldn't possibly be important. Not with that skin. Not in this room. They humiliated him. They stole his work. They buried his name. But what they didn't know, what they never even thought to ask, was who they were really dealing with. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't for attention. It was a warning. This is not just a story about racism in tech. This is about what happens when the man you tried to shame owns the floor you're standing on, and the future you thought you controlled. Where do you think this story is going? What would you have done in his place? And where are you watching from right now? Tell us in the comments. We want to hear your voice. If this hits you in the chest, if you believe stories like this need to be told, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with someone who's been underestimated. Stay right here, because the twist? You haven't even seen it yet. Elijah Cross walked into the glass-paneled conference room with a folder under one arm and a quiet determination shadowing his every step. He had always been deliberate in his manner, sharp, exacting, the kind of man who listened twice before speaking once. It was 8 a.m. sharp, and the Monday morning strategy review was already in full swing. The room, a mix of executives in tailored suits and tech leads in crisp polos, quieted for a beat as Elijah took his place near the far end of the oval table. Not because he was late, he never was, but because he wasn't someone most of them expected to be there. Brad Whitaker, the Vice President of Strategic Operations, stood near the touchscreen display with his signature smirk and double-breasted suit. Mid-40s, gelled hair, voice like sandpaper dipped in honey. He was the kind of man who made deals over whiskey and bragged about them in golf carts. Brad paused when he saw Elijah, his eyes lingering for just a second too long before turning back to the screen. Well, he said, loud enough to draw attention. Look who decided to upgrade from IT support to boardroom strategist. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room. Elijah didn't flinch. He set his folder down and calmly adjusted his tie. "Good morning, everyone," he said evenly, his voice deep and steady, tinged with a Midwestern lilt that had long since been trained into boardroom cadence. "I was asked to present the integration framework for the Gen 7 AI pipeline. If it's a bad time, I can wait." His eyes locked on Brad's. Brad grinned, but it didn't reach his eyes. No. Let's all see what the genius from maintenance has to say about artificial intelligence. The remark landed like a slap dressed up as a joke. A few eyes widened. A few heads turned toward their screens. Elijah didn't look away. "Actually," he said, "my last framework cut the company's model training costs by 41% and tripled throughput. So call me what you want, but call the numbers too." Silence. Then someone cleared their throat, embarrassed. Brad waved a hand dismissively. "Relax, folks. Just having some fun. Go on, Cross, wow us." It wasn't the words. It was the way he said them. Like Elijah was the entertainment. Like he didn't belong. For the next 20 minutes, Elijah delivered the strategy with surgical precision. Graphs, metrics, projections that turned skeptical frowns into raised eyebrows. He answered questions before they were asked, predicted market threats before anyone else had finished reading the current slides. When he was done, the room was quiet again, but this time it was a different quiet. Respectful, almost impressed. Brad clapped slowly. "Not bad. Didn't think you had it in you." He turned to HR rep Megan Shaw, who sat near the head of the table. "Megan, remind me, we doing any cultural alignment checks for our innovation hires? Just want to make sure folks can, fit the tone upstairs." The subtext wasn't just clear, it was broadcast. Elijah didn't blink. He collected his folder, nodded politely, and stepped out of the room. But inside, something had already cracked. Not broken, just cracked. Later that day, Megan received an email marked confidential internal only. Subject: Evaluation Request Elijah Cross. Sent by Brad Whitaker. The body was brief. Megan, per our earlier discussion, please initiate a soft review of Mr. Cross's cultural adaptability and long-term departmental fit. Concerns have been raised regarding team dynamics. Flag for mid-tier repositioning options if alignment doesn't hold. B. Megan stared at the email, fingers hovering over the reply button. She didn't remember having an earlier discussion, because there hadn't been one, and concerns hadn't been voiced by anyone. But Brad didn't need discussions. He issued directives dressed as suggestions, and people followed. Elijah had spent months fine-tuning a dynamic data prioritization protocol, codenamed Argus, that used live environmental feedback to reshape predictive models in real time. It was lean, elegant, and disruptive, the kind of architecture that could save clients millions and potentially patent a new category of neurocompression. But when he arrived at the pre-pitch strategy session that morning, something fell off. His folder, which he'd submitted the night before with full documentation, wasn't on the table. Instead, Dylan Marks, junior engineer, white, 3 years out of Stanford with more swagger than substance, was already seated at the head of the room, running through a clunky version of Elijah's Argus framework, as if it were his own. Elijah blinked. Then he listened. The terminology was his. The model flowcharts were his. Even the damn color scheme on the PowerPoint was the same. The only difference was the name. It had been quietly changed from Argus to Dynamo, and Dylan didn't mention Elijah once. Brad stood beside him, arms crossed, nodding approvingly as the rest of the executive team took notes. Elijah waited until Dylan clicked past the final slide before calmly speaking. That framework, he said, his voice level, was developed under my account credentials, tested on my server, and submitted to R&D with my signature. I'd like to understand how it ended up here without my name on it. The room fell awkwardly silent. Dylan looked toward Brad, clearly unprepared for confrontation. Brad, unflinching, smiled and stepped forward. "Relax, Cross," he said. "It's not about who came up with what. It's a team effort. Dylan's just the one presenting today." Elijah's jaw tensed. "I wasn't informed of any handoff." Brad shrugged. "Chain of command. I decide who represents what to the board." Dylan was more polished for the room. The words weren't even subtle. Elijah scanned the faces around the table, some blank, some uncomfortable, none willing to speak up. The meeting moved on without him. Later that afternoon, in a glass-walled corner office high above the city, Brad leaned back in his leather chair as he briefed 2 senior directors, Donna Tice from Product Ops and CFO Glenn Warner. The conversation was supposed to be about capital deployment timelines, but it veered. "I'll be honest," Brad said, swirling a glass of club soda like it was bourbon. "I've got nothing against Cross. He's sharp. But let's be real, he was a diversity hire. Upper brass wanted optics. Tech's been under pressure ever since the board started talking about ESG goals." Donna raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Glenn glanced up from his tablet, frowning slightly. "You're saying he wasn't qualified?" Brad chuckled. "I'm saying he was strategically qualified. He checked the right boxes. Good PR, smart enough to make noise, not enough to make waves. Useful, but not leadership material." The statement hung in the air, ugly and unspoken no longer. It wasn't just prejudice, it was calculated containment. When the meeting ended, Glenn lingered by the door. "You do realize he's been outperforming the whole advanced modeling team for 2 quarters, right?" Brad gave a casual shrug. "And yet not a single VC name on his resume. Sometimes you need pedigree, not just horsepower." Glenn left without another word. Meanwhile, Elijah sat alone at his workstation, eyes fixed on the dim glow of his secondary monitor, where the Argus logs still lived. Time-stamped, verifiable, indisputable. He wasn't angry. Not exactly. Anger was too simple. What he felt was deeper. A mix of betrayal, clarity, and quiet resolve. He saved a private encrypted backup of his original source code and documentation to a remote vault. Not out of paranoia. Out of practice. He'd been here before. Different city. Different company. Same game. At first, he chalked it up to awkwardness from the presentation debacle, the silent complicity that followed Dylan's performance. But the pattern didn't fade. it deepened. Then came the email. It wasn't sent directly to him. It wasn't even public, but its effect was viral. An anonymous message circulated to a handful of internal HR contacts and a few mid-tier managers, suggesting that Elijah's academic credentials were inconsistent with verified institutional records. The email was short, untraceable, crafted from a spoofed external domain with no reply route. It didn't accuse outright, it merely raised concerns about possible credential inflation, suggesting a deeper dive might be in order. No one knew who authored it, but its language had fingerprints, Brad's. The tone, the phrasing, the weaponization of plausible doubt masked in bureaucratic politeness. It was signature Brad. And while HR didn't act formally, the effects were swift and silent. Within 2 days, Elijah was asked to submit his original transcripts for audit purposes, a request never before made of any other senior-level strategist at his rank. Elijah complied, of course. He had nothing to hide. Degrees from Carnegie Mellon and Caltech, both verifiable. But he knew the damage wasn't about facts, it was about seeds. Seeds of doubt, sown in the minds of people who never had the chance to know him beyond the color of his skin and the title under his name. He kept his composure. He always had. But beneath the calm surface, something shifted in him. A resolve. A hardening. He started to observe, not react. To record, document, track. This wasn't about clearing his name. It was about finishing something. The final blow came Friday morning, during what was supposed to be the high point of his quarter. Elijah had spent months nurturing a relationship with Masaka Tech, a Tokyo-based AI firm renowned for its precision algorithms and clean data architecture. He had initiated the connection during a tech expo in Singapore, flown to Japan on his own dime to meet the CTO in person, and had since built the rapport to secure a cross-collaboration pitch with their innovation team. It was a potential $170 million joint development deal. And today, the call that would finalize the proposal was scheduled at 7 a.m. sharp, via the company's executive Zoom channel. At 6:52 a.m., Elijah was dressed in a dark blazer, his notes open, his slides rehearsed and prepared. He sat alone in conference room 14B, waiting for the link to activate. But the screen stayed dark. At 7:01 a.m., he refreshed. Still no access. At 7:04, he called IT. No reported outages. At 7:09, he texted Brad. No reply. At 7:13, he finally got an answer from Donna in Product Ops. The meeting had been rescheduled, she said, due to restructuring of the lead communication pathway. Translation: Elijah had been pulled. Replaced. Again. Donna sounded uncomfortable as she spoke, her words careful. Brad's leading the call now, along with Dylan. They thought, given the recent questions, it was better to show more internal continuity. Elijah didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The hollow pit in his gut said enough. He closed his laptop, sat back, and let the silence fill the room. Not the kind that came from being excluded, but the kind that always preceded something seismic. He stared at the frosted glass walls, listening to the low hum of air vents and the occasional footsteps in the hallway. They had just taken the one thing he couldn't rebuild overnight: trust from a global partner who believed he was the face of the future. Engineers whispered about the breakthrough model. Senior analysts quietly studied its logic trees with a mixture of admiration and confusion, and the board had already pushed a memo to consider it a flagship product line by year's end. But despite the origin of its success, there wasn't a single line in the official company bulletin that mentioned Elijah Cross. Not a word. Instead, Brad held a live-streamed company-wide town hall titled The Future of Predictive Intelligence, flanked by Dylan and 2 new data scientists, both white, both freshly poached from a competing firm, and announced to over 1,200 employees that Dynamo's core strength lies in the collaborative genius of our next-gen team, led by Dylan Marks. The applause was immediate. The credit was cleanly stolen. Elijah watched the live stream from a side conference room, the corners of his mouth pulled into something too tight to be a smile. He sat in silence, hands folded, staring at Dylan on the screen as he confidently rattled off benchmarks he barely understood. Elijah knew the code better than he knew most people. He recognized it the way a composer recognizes his own melody, even when someone else tries to reorchestrate it. But instead of frustration, he felt something colder settle inside him, a precise stillness, like the click of a safety switch right before a trigger pull. The next morning, as if to drive the message deeper, Elijah received an email from facilities management. It was brief, direct, and impersonal. Effective Monday, your workstation will be relocated to the Innovation Annex, South Wing, Level B2. This is part of our larger reconfiguration plan to enhance interdepartmental synergy and reduce congestion on the main R&D floor. Level B2 wasn't technically a basement, but it felt like one. It was where underfunded teams and overflow interns were stashed. It was also the farthest you could be from the executive core without stepping outside the building. Elijah read the message 3 times. There was no CC to HR. No rationale beyond the vague synergy buzzword. Just another quiet push downward. He didn't protest. He packed his things without fanfare. A few engineers passed his desk, offering small nods or looks of confusion, but no one said a word. No one wanted to be seen standing next to a man whose name had been deleted from success. When Elijah arrived at Level B2, the air was colder, the carpet thinner, and the walls an outdated off-white that hadn't seen renovation in a decade. The only window faced a concrete loading bay. He set up his laptop, restored his server connections, and got to work like nothing had changed. But everything had. That afternoon, while reviewing a new test protocol, Elijah received a Slack message from Ava Brandt, Director of Global Partnerships, and one of the only executives who had quietly supported his promotion 6 months ago. The message was short. I just got word from Tokyo. Masakatech is confused. They say Dylan doesn't understand the foundational algorithm and wants to speak directly with you. Want me to patch you in? Elijah stared at the message for a long second before replying. Hold. Let me handle it. He opened a secure backchannel he'd set up months earlier, before the internal sabotage began, and typed out a short message to Masakatech's CTO, Kenji Morimoto. In fluent Japanese, he wrote, I understand there has been confusion. The architecture you reviewed in Singapore is being represented inaccurately. I'm available for a direct briefing at your discretion. There's more I can explain, off record. Over the weekend, he had finalized a new simulation model based on the original Argus logic tree, a version stripped of all the corporate branding and renamed under his own IP, quietly registered to a Delaware shell company he had incorporated 3 months prior. It wasn't revenge. It was insurance. But just as he began uploading the final module into a secure sandbox, his screen froze. Not a lag. A hard stop. Red text blinked across the terminal. Access denied, user authorization revoked. Elijah blinked. He hit refresh. Same result. He tried the admin shell. Locked out. Server timeout. A second later, a Slack message popped up from IT operations. Hey Elijah, looks like there's been a permissions bug from the weekend push. Might take a few hours to fix. Sorry for the inconvenience. He knew better. A bug that targeted only his credentials. Right before an investor review? It was no accident. At exactly 10 a.m., Elijah was expected in the 14th floor boardroom for the Q3 update meeting with the company's internal investment council, a mix of C-suite executives and external financial analysts brought in to gauge portfolio readiness. His portion of the presentation, originally scheduled to demonstrate the next evolution of the Dynamo model, had been slashed down from 20 minutes to 5, and he'd been instructed to present supporting data only, while Dylan led the showcase. Still, Elijah prepared as best he could, piecing together what screenshots he had salvaged before being locked out. But when he arrived, Brad was already holding court at the head of the table, laughing as he sipped from a glass of sparkling water and flicked through the opening slides. The room was full, and everyone looked alert, caffeinated, ready to move. Elijah took a seat at the far end, unnoticed or ignored. Midway through Dylan's presentation, he stumbled over an answer about model volatility drift. He looked to Elijah for backup. Brad interrupted. Let's move on, he said quickly, brushing it off. It's a minor technical detail, nothing the boy at the end can't fix later. The room froze for half a second, just enough for the weight of the word to hang, heavy and deliberate. The boy echoed louder than the laughter Brad tried to play it off with. Elijah didn't move. He didn't blink. His face stayed neutral, but his chest burned cold. Several analysts exchanged looks. One of them, a senior partner from Bainwell Holdings, raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me," she said sharply. "Did you just refer to Mr. Cross as boy?" Brad chuckled awkwardly, waving a hand. "Oh, come on. It's just a figure of speech. We joke like that all the time. Isn't that right, Elijah?" Elijah met his gaze across the table, eyes calm but unflinching. "Not with me, you don't." The silence that followed was leaden. The meeting lurched forward, but the atmosphere never recovered. When it was Elijah's turn to present, he stood without notes and calmly explained the key discrepancies in the public dynamo framework compared to the original private model. Without naming names, he laid out subtle technical gaps that only someone who had built the architecture would notice. Gaps that, if unaddressed, could lead to cascading prediction failures at scale. The council members listened closely. One of them jotted notes rapidly. Dylan looked visibly uncomfortable. Brad leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, expression tightening. After the session ended, Elijah received another Slack message, this one from HR. "We'd like to schedule a follow-up discussion regarding your conduct during this morning's investment review. Please confirm availability." He stared at the screen for a long time. They were trying to flip the narrative. First the server access, then the /time. Now this. They wanted to frame him as unstable, reactionary, difficult, a liability. But what they didn't know was that Elijah had already documented everything. The memo read like a victory anthem. "This marks a new era of global intelligence. Please join us as we unveil our leadership team and celebrate a future we are all building together." Elijah stared at the email as it flashed across his screen. His name was not on the agenda. Dylan's was 3 times, as keynote speaker, as project lead, and as the official face of the Orion collaboration. The blow was expected, but it still landed hard. Elijah didn't say a word. Instead, he closed the tab and returned to his terminal where his Real work waited, encrypted and far beyond the company's firewalled servers. Later that afternoon, Brad called a full department huddle on the 12th floor. The glass walls shimmered in the sun as everyone gathered around the digital display where a bold title read, "Orion Integration Phase Alpha, Public Launch Protocol." Brad stood at the center, beaming like a campaigner announcing his running mate. "Today, I want to introduce the man who'll be leading our firm into the global stage," he said, his voice rich with theater. "He's young. He's sharp. He speaks 7 languages, well 3 fluently," Brad joked, gesturing at Dylan. "And most importantly, he reflects the professionalism, the consistency, and the trusted image we want the world to associate with Zenith." The room applauded, some genuinely, others mechanically. Elijah stood near the back, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Brad glanced at him once, just briefly, and smiled like a man who knew exactly what he'd done. Later that night, the gala unfolded inside the rooftop ballroom of the Atlas Hotel, glittering with suspended lights and a skyline view that stretched from harbor to horizon. The floor shimmered beneath polished shoes. The air was thick with champagne and self-congratulation. Elijah moved through the crowd like a ghost, present but unseen, dressed in a midnight black suit that blended with the shadows along the back wall. He didn't drink. He didn't smile. He watched. Near the center, Brad held court again, surrounded by partners, interns, execs, and foreign investors. Dylan stood beside him, flushed with attention, laughing a little too loudly at jokes he barely understood. When Brad noticed Elijah standing alone near the balcony doors, he excused himself from the group and approached slowly, glass in hand, expression smooth like polished marble. "Elijah," he said with mock warmth, "you clean up well. I was afraid you wouldn't show." Elijah didn't respond. Brad leaned in slightly, dropping his voice low, casual, like a friend sharing an inside joke. "I'm going to tell you something off the record," he said. "You're brilliant. Honestly, one of the sharpest minds we've ever had here." He took a sip of his drink and smiled wider. But you and I both know that brilliance isn't everything. People invest in what they recognize, what they're comfortable with. You challenge that too much. Elijah's eyes didn't flinch. Brad continued, voice like velvet over venom. You were never going to be the face of this, Elijah. Not here. Not with these people. You're too intense, too principled, too you. And this world doesn't move for men like you. It makes room for people like Dylan, safe, likable, familiar. He stepped back, eyes gleaming. I know that stings, but I'm just being honest. You're meant for back-end brilliance, not the front page. For a second, the noise of the party seemed to fade. Elijah looked out over the skyline, his mind already calculating the timing, the pressure points, the exact coordinates of collapse. He could burn this place down tonight, with one call, with one file. But not yet. He turned back to Brad, his voice calm. You're right, he said simply. This world wasn't built for people like me. He adjusted his cuff and met Brad's eyes. But that's exactly why I'm going to change it. Every second was measured, every motion intentional. At the stage, the house band was wrapping up a polished rendition of a Coldplay cover, while a company vice president prepared to give a closing toast. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly as a spot centered on the podium, and the audience of developers, investors, and executives turned to the front in anticipation. That's when Elijah made his move. Without rushing, without hesitating, he stepped forward, bypassing the confused event planner and ascending the small stage with the calm assurance of a man not seeking permission, only opportunity. The room stirred. Conversations paused. A few people murmured. Brad, mid-sip of his champagne, froze when he saw who was now adjusting the mic. Good evening, Elijah said, voice steady, calm, clear. The audio system projected his tone across the ballroom, like a ripple of cold water slicing through velvet. I promise I won't take long, but I think it's time we all got reacquainted with the truth. The room stilled. Phones lowered. Eyebrows lifted. My name is Elijah Cross. I'm the engineer who designed the core framework behind the Dynamo model you're all celebrating tonight. You won't find my name on the banners or the press packets, but the code tells no lies, and history won't either. A quiet gasp rolled through the room, followed by uncomfortable shifting in seats. Dylan paled. Brad's face tensed, eyes narrowing with the first taste of panic. Elijah continued, unwavering. For months, I've been subjected to manipulation, theft, humiliation, and strategic erasure. My ideas were stolen. My access was restricted. My reputation was quietly sabotaged. Why? Not because of my performance, but because of perception. Because I didn't fit the brand. A heavy silence blanketed the space. I tolerated the silence. Until now. He reached into his inside coat pocket and pulled out a sleek black flash drive, holding it up between two fingers. What you don't know is that I've been documenting everything. Emails, audio from closed-door meetings, network logs, code version histories. I've also been working closely with partners from Tokyo, Singapore, and Zurich. And I'd like to introduce someone tonight, someone you've never seen, but who has been very present. He clicked a remote, and a massive screen behind him flickered to life. A recorded video began to play. It showed Elijah weeks earlier in a sleek conference room seated beside Kenji Morimoto and several members of Masaka Tekka's executive board. Kenji's voice translated clearly through subtitles. We've agreed to assign the investment to whichever entity demonstrates transparency, ethical leadership, and long-term social responsibility. The screen cut to another clip. This one showing a call with Geneva-based tech investors at Polaris AI Fund. A woman in a blazer addressed the camera. Elijah Cross is our official proxy and advisory partner in North America. No final signatures will be issued without his review. The room erupted in stunned silence. Elijah leaned forward into the mic, his voice sharpening just slightly. I am the reason this partnership exists. I brought the technology. I brought the money. I brought the future. Then he turned slowly, locking eyes with Brad from across the ballroom. And let me be very clear, I'm also the reason it can all be taken away. Murmurs rippled like aftershocks. Some executives stood. Others looked toward Brad, waiting for a response that wouldn't come. Elijah straightened his jacket. Starting tonight, the Orion contract will be frozen pending an internal audit of Zenith's executive conduct, diversity policies, and leadership ethics. The firms I represent, who collectively hold over $2.4 billion in vested interest, will not partner with any entity that tolerates systemic bias or intentional erasure. Not anymore. But the one man who didn't move, who couldn't, was Brad Whitaker. He sat rigid in his seat, hands clutched around a glass of flat champagne, face pale beneath the soft lighting that had once flattered him but now exposed him. Elijah didn't return to the fringe of the room. He walked straight into the center of the storm, toward the crowd forming near the back, where two of the company's largest institutional shareholders, Angela Yuan from Horizon Equity and Thomas Brandt from Orion Capital, were watching with stern, unreadable faces. Angela nodded as Elijah approached, no words needed. Thomas glanced at his phone, then up at Elijah. "It's done," he said simply. "Signed and filed 27 minutes ago." Elijah nodded. Then he turned around. He moved back toward the stage, not to speak again, but to stand at the front edge where the light met shadow. This time, he didn't use the microphone. He didn't need it. The room had quieted on its own. "Some of you may be wondering why I'm here tonight," he said, voice calm, but with a steel undertone that cut clean through every corner of the space. The answer is simple. I'm not just the one who built the code. I'm not just the one who brought the funding. I'm now also part owner of this company. He let the words settle. A few gasps rippled through the crowd, and one junior VP audibly dropped his wine glass. Through a coordinated acquisition with Horizon, Orion, and a silent partner based in Zurich, Elijah continued. I now represent a 35% controlling interest in Zenith Technologies. His eyes swept across the room, stopping on Brad. Effective immediately, the executive board has approved a motion of interim suspension against Mr. Brad Whitaker, pending a full review of his leadership practices, documented incidents of misconduct, and breach of fiduciary responsibility. Brad's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. His face was flushed, pupils wide. "You don't have the authority," he muttered, voice cracking. "Yes," Elijah replied, "I do." He turned his gaze toward the room. "I will not replace Brad's cruelty with vengeance, but I will replace his power with accountability." Then, for the first time all night, Elijah smiled, not out of pride but clarity. He pivoted toward Dylan, who had edged behind the dessert table, visibly trying to disappear. "Dylan," Elijah said, his tone light, almost conversational. "That presentation you gave last week, the one about real-time thermal adaptation and recursive bias filtering?" Dylan nodded hesitantly, unsure if it was a trap. "It was polished," Elijah said. "Only problem is it wasn't new. That framework was submitted under provisional patent number 917, ZK3, registered to CrossLogic Technologies, LLC, filed 3 months ago." Dylan's eyes widened as the weight of the statement hit him. "Which means," Elijah continued, "any commercial use of it without licensing would constitute infringement, effective immediately." A ripple of nervous laughter cracked through the air, but was quickly silenced by Elijah's next words. "But don't worry, I won't pursue it. Not if this team decides to start leading with merit instead of mimicry." The silence that followed wasn't stunned, it was reverent. Elijah wasn't just exposing a broken system. He was offering a blueprint for something better. He took one final look around the room, then addressed the crowd directly. "Let this be a turning point, not just for me, not just for the company, but for the culture we've all enabled in silence. If you believe in fairness, stay. If you believe in what we've built, stand up and help me build it right. But if you're here to protect comfort over integrity, your time's up." Elijah didn't release an official press statement. He didn't need to. The truth had already gone viral. A short clip recorded on someone's phone, Brad leaning in toward Elijah during the gala and smugly declaring, "This world doesn't move for men like you," surfaced on social media within 12 hours. The post, uploaded without commentary, ignited a digital firestorm. Hashtags like hashtag erase to replace and hashtag Elijah Cross trended worldwide. Within 24 hours, the clip had amassed over 6 million views, prompting op-eds, think pieces, and morning news debates dissecting not just Brad's words, but the culture they reflected. The footage spread like gasoline over dry brush, igniting corporate accountability conversations that could no longer be ignored. By the end of the week, Zenith's board issued a formal notice. Brad Whitaker had been relieved of all responsibilities, effective immediately, citing breach of ethical standards and failure to uphold corporate integrity. The statement was clinical, precise, and merciless. But what the public didn't know was how quickly Brad's world collapsed behind the scenes. Overnight, his corporate inbox was deactivated, his keycard revoked, his name scrubbed from the leadership directory. He didn't get a farewell lunch or a golden parachute, just a private HR escort down the executive elevator and into the back seat of a waiting car. His severance was frozen pending review, and every pending deal he had managed was reassigned or canceled. But the worst was yet to come, because while Brad grappled with the humiliation of being erased from the empire he once ruled, a much deeper investigation had begun to unfold. The Securities and Exchange Commission had opened an inquiry into Zenith's leadership practices after an anonymous whistleblower submitted detailed logs, timestamps, emails, private messages, documenting years of discriminatory decision-making and resource redirection away from minority-led projects. That whistleblower, as everyone in the office already suspected, was Elijah. The audit revealed internal memos where Brad had greenlit inflated bonuses for select department heads while blocking promotions and funding for diverse teams under the guise of cost containment. He had buried 3 major patent applications submitted by employees of color and funneled their work into larger white-led teams without credit. The findings were damning. When the story broke on Bloomberg Tech, Elijah didn't watch the coverage. He was too busy restructuring the leadership framework of the company he now co-owned. New roles were created, new names elevated. One of the first things he did was reinstate every proposal that had been tabled under Brad's regime. The second thing was even more radical. He opened a private channel for staff to anonymously report any instance of bias, retaliation, or credit theft, promising independent arbitration and real consequences. Within days, the inbox flooded. Meanwhile, Brad found himself without a future. His phone stopped ringing. Invitations vanished. His LinkedIn connections dwindled. Investors who once toasted him in rooftop lounges now ignored his calls. Former allies ducked media questions. Even Dylan, once the golden boy of the Dynamo project, had quietly filed for a transfer to a sister company in Vancouver, citing burnout and professional misalignment. No one wanted to be tethered to a sinking ship, and it sank fast. A week later, The Atlantic published a profile titled The Fall of the Face: How Elijah Cross Broke Silicon Valley's Quiet Wall. It chronicled not only the betrayal Elijah endured, but how he transformed that pain into power, redefining what leadership could look like in an industry still ruled by optics over substance. The piece went viral not because it was scandalous, but because it was undeniable. The truth had been witnessed, and once seen, it could not be unseen. Whitaker stood on a worn wooden stage in a modest community center on the south side of Chicago, far from the towering skylines and corner offices that once defined his life. The air was different here, less performative, more honest. Behind him, a faded banner read Future Coders, building equity through access. Around him sat 50 teenagers, mostly Black and Latino, most of whom had never heard of Zenith or the scandal that consumed it. They didn't know Brad's history, but they recognized something in his posture, tentative, no longer towering. He had come to volunteer, first reluctantly, then regularly. After his fall from grace, job offers dried up, former colleagues turned cold, and even his family distanced themselves from the mess. With nowhere to go, Brad followed a referral from a former HR coordinator who, despite everything, believed that rock bottom could be a beginning. At first, he simply organized donated laptops. Then, he stayed late to help with Python syntax. And over time, he listened more than he spoke. It was in those silent moments, watching a young girl debug a sorting algorithm, or hearing a 17-year-old explain his dream to build a game engine, that something in Brad began to shift. Not because he was forced to change, but because he finally understood what he had never cared to see. When future coders invited him to speak at their local TEDx-style event, he almost declined. But a part of him knew that if growth was real, it had to be spoken. So he said yes. He stood now, palms open at his sides, eyes steady. "My name is Brad Whitaker," he began, voice softer than before. "You don't know me, and that's okay. What you need to know is this: I used to believe that power was something you earned through position, pedigree, and perception. I believed that leadership meant taking up space, not making room." The room was still. Brad continued, 3 months ago, I lost everything. My job, my reputation, my network. And it happened because I tried to erase someone who wouldn't let himself be erased. His name is Elijah Cross, and he changed my life, not because he punished me, but because he exposed me, to the world and to myself. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Brad took a breath. I called him a quota. I called him a problem. I mocked him to his face and tried to bury his legacy under my ego. And when he stood on that stage and revealed the truth, I didn't just lose a career. I lost the illusion that I was ever more than the room let me pretend to be. A moment passed before Brad spoke again, this time with a weight that couldn't be faked. "Elijah, if you're ever watching this, I want you to know I'm sorry. Not just for what I said, but for every time I used silence as a shield and culture as a cage. I used to think justice was punishment. Now I understand it's repair." The crowd was silent, not because they were stunned, but because they were listening. In the back row, an older man in a dark coat leaned against the wall. Arms crossed, expression unreadable. He didn't clap. He didn't speak. But he nodded, just once, before slipping out, before anyone noticed. Elijah didn't need to be seen. He'd already said everything that needed to be said. That night, Brad walked home alone. The streets were cold, but not unkind. He passed a mural on the side of a library, an image of a black boy holding a circuit board like a treasure. Underneath, the words read, "Your mind is your superpower." Brad paused for a long moment, then smiled. It was a small smile, one that didn't ask to be noticed. He knew the world hadn't forgiven him, and maybe it never would. But for the first time, he wasn't seeking redemption. He was building something different, something better. Not a reputation, but a record. Not a brand, but a bridge. And somewhere, in a corner of the tech world he once claimed to control, Elijah Cross sat in a quiet office, reviewing a new proposal from a grassroots coding initiative. It was well written, humble, and signed by a man who finally understood what real leadership looked like. The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss more powerful narratives like this. We'd love to know, what part of Elijah's journey hit you the hardest? And where in the world are you watching from today? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters here.